Hello and welcome to Since Attlee Churchill, the podcast about British political history since the Second World War. I'm Lee Evans, a historian of the Conservative Party.
And I'm Richard Johnson, a historian of the Labour Party, and Lee's husband. In each episode, we'll be chewing over delightful morsels of British political history.
And this is a special bonus episode to mark 10 years since Britain dramatically voted to leave the European Union. And unlike our usual episodes, it's an interview with Matthew Elliott, Lord Elliott, the chief exec of the Vote Leave campaign, who I think we can say is one of a very small handful of people, really, who shaped that decision to vote leave 10 years ago, and without whom I think I would even say that Britain would not have voted to leave when it did.
And Matthew is the author of a new book which comes out on Brexit Day on the 23rd of June called 10 Years On, The Untold Story of Brexit, which is his reflections on his life from his early years, but with a particular focus on his campaigning, not just in the EU referendum, but also as the political director of No to AV, the electoral reform referendum, which we've also done an episode on in our Cameron's Referendums mini-series.
There's a link to Lord Elliott's new book in the show notes, but here's our interview with him. Well, Lord Elliott, thank you so much for joining us on Since Attlee Churchill. Many of our listeners will know you perhaps best for being the chief exec of the Vote Leave campaign, but pretty soon they will know you also as the author of 10 Years On, The Untold Story of Brexit. So we're delighted to have this chance to dig into some of the themes of your new book and to talk about the campaign 10 years ago that arguably changed the course of British history.
Thank you very much.
And Matthew, this book is a real treasure trove, speaking as a historian, because it contains so many primary sources, which I think haven't seen the light of day before. You include lengthy quotes from emails and text messages and WhatsApps. You say you used voice notes and letters as well. So much has never been seen before. But this is not just a book about political back and forth, although there's a lot of that in here, but this is also a book about, it's your biography, it's a book about you as well. And people, I think, might be surprised to know about your upbringing. You grew up in Hare Hills in Leeds, in a working class area in the 1980s. Your parents were, as you described them, Christian socialists, and your father was a social worker and your mother was a teacher. And yet you became a convinced Thatcherite. So why did you become a Thatcherite? And is there anything of your parents' politics that rubbed off onto you?
That's a really great question. I remember growing up in the 80s in Leeds, you say, and my parents were sort of Christian socialists. But my grandfather, or my mum's dad, was a shopkeeper. And he had a shop after the war, a small shop in Birmingham, and then come up to Leeds, where he headed up a sort of bigger retail department. And he was a big Thatcher fan, and she could do no wrong in his eyes. And I remember those sort of Sunday lunchtime discussions when we were all around the table with my grandparents, and he and my dad would have a good back and forth, sometimes an argument about what she was up to. And they were really sort of politically explosive times, and my grandfather was convinced she was doing absolutely right for the economy. My dad had more worries, and perhaps he, as a social worker, saw a little bit more on the front line the effect that some of her economic policies had in the sense of the economic transition that came with Thatcherism. So hearing that debate really inspired my politics, and I went more with my grandfather. That said, though, reflecting back sort of where I am now, I can see some of what my dad's done has rubbed off on me in the sense that, first of all, my passion for politics. In the 80s, when I was growing up, he used to be in charge of the electoral roll for our council area. And things used to be sort of very low tech at the time, where you'd have these paid a nominal sum in an area, and they would sort of fold up the electoral roll, put it in an envelope, deliver it to all the houses. Hopefully they'd be delivered back. If they weren't, you went back to the house and knocked on the door, and it was all done by sort of semi-volunteers, if you like. And my dad was one of them. And as a kid, I was there folding things up, delivering them, not quite knocking on the doors myself, but that was my first taste into the role of elections in the UK. And I'd like to think as well that some of his politics also rubbed off on me when it came to setting up the Jobs Foundation, my latest charity.
The story that you've written about, primarily the story of Brexit, is of course a story about political institutions and about different campaign groups and so much more besides. But it's also in many ways a deeply personal story about the politicians and their rivalries and their perspectives as well. And so I wondered about your own conversion, if it was a conversion, or your own emerging sense that you were a Eurosceptic, that would be your side of this argument if ever the question were put. What made you a Eurosceptic?
That's a really great question, because I think, like a lot of people who voted Leave, for me, it evolved over time. So going back to my time at university, I was at the LSE in the late 1990s, early 2000s, and the big live debate at the time was, should Britain join the euro? It wasn't decided who the original members would be. Tony Blair was flirting with it. Gordon Brown was saying that it'd be a bad move for the UK, egged on by Ed Balls, I think, and Charlie Whelan. So that was the politics of the time. But I was really sceptical about Britain joining the euro, and it was primarily for sovereignty-based reasons. I didn't want to give up control of our monetary policy. But I wasn't a Brexiteer at that point, and indeed, all the way up to setting up Business for Britain in 2013, the message of Business for Britain was twofold. First of all, yes to an EU referendum. But secondly, our position was change or go. If the EU is able to reform and change along the lines of the David Cameron's Bloomberg speech, I would be fine with staying in the EU. But if it wasn't, I'd be up for a leave. So really, for me, it wasn't until it was very, very clear that Cameron wasn't going to get any form of deal that I fully committed to leave. I didn't think he'd get a very good deal, but it wasn't until the moment in about July 2015, after the election, when it was very clear there wouldn't be any treaty change, so there wouldn't be any change in our relationship, that I really came out to leave.
You did write a very perceptive essay when you were a sixth former in the 1990s, predicting the Eurozone crisis. And
yes.
In particular, you zeroed in on the relationship between the strong German economy and the relatively weaker Greek economy, which of course also played out as you saw it. So that was really quite interesting to see that in the book. Jumping ahead now to the 2010s and the Cameron referendums period, which is what we're doing a mini-series on in the Since Attlee Churchill podcast, you become the campaign director for No to AV. And I wonder, reflecting on that campaign, which was a very successful campaign, what were the key lessons that you learned from the AV referendum that you then applied in the EU referendum?
That's a great question. So just first of all, very, very quickly, how I became the campaign director. So that's worth a sort of little footnote in history, in the sense that after the general election, when, of course, Cameron did his famous coalition agreement with Nick Clegg, part of that deal was having this AV referendum. And, of course, there was uproar within the Conservative backbenches that, first of all, Cameron hadn't managed to secure victory, but then sort of got into bed with Nick Clegg and the Lib Dems and had this referendum. So there was a real possibility that the No campaign was going to be run by the people who are not just sceptical about Britain moving towards AV, but also sceptical about Cameron and his leadership of the Conservative Party. So it was at that point when people like Bernard Jenkins and others were emerging to form this No campaign that David Cameron got in touch with Rodney Leach, one of my mentors, and basically said, can you pull together a No campaign? So Rodney approached me and the two of us basically ran the No campaign for Cameron. In terms of the lessons learned, a few points. First of all, the importance of having the right message. I think with all sorts of referendums, because they're on often quite sort of detailed subjects, it's very easy to get dragged into the minutiae of the detail rather than treating it a bit more like you would a general election campaign where you come out with major messages and major themes. So thinking back to my time at the LSE, I did a whole course, a whole year-long course on electoral systems where I'm sure you're both familiar with these, where literally first week, first past the post, next week AV, the week after that supplementary vote, the week after that the D'Hondt system. You go through them in minute detail, evaluating the different systems and the pros and cons of them. So there was a temptation that we could have done, which would be do it purely on AV and the specifics of AV and which countries it's used in and this sort of thing. And it would have got caught up in all of that detail. So we really went for the fact, what are the key ideas behind it? And the key concerns of voters were, first of all, the costs of changing the Britain's voting system. And at a time when Cameron was implementing his so-called austerity, why should we put all this money into changing our voting system? So that came up with the 250 million figure for changing it, which has obvious parallels with the EU referendum campaign with 350 million. So that was one key lesson learnt. And we also went for the one person, one vote message, making the point that it's unfair for some people to have more than one vote, if you like, when it comes to AV. And again, that inspired some of the simplicity of our messaging in terms of taking back control, our money, our priorities that we had with the EU referendum. So I think messaging is really important for, that's a lesson learnt. But also another key lesson was having the right messengers. Who are the right messengers for this referendum where in AV? Really, what we wanted was basically Labour Party voters and Labour Party ministers speaking out on our behalf, because it was pretty obvious we were going to get Conservatives. David Cameron had expressed his opposition. We needed to push him into actually campaigning heavily, but he'd expressed his opposition. So we need Labour on side, Labour voters across the line. So forming the campaign, having the likes of John Reid, Margaret Beckett, David Blunkett, John Prescott, Charlie Falconer coming out for no was really important, because at that point you then had 2/3 of Labour MPs and peers for no versus Ed Miliband, the new Labour leader, being in favour of yes. So that meant that when it came to the referendum campaign itself, voters looking at the campaigns thought, right, actually most Tories and most Labour people are backing no, so I can vote no too. So having the right messaging is so important as well.
And if I can just also follow up, thinking about your opponents in both of the referendum campaigns.
Yes.
Who do you think ran the better or stronger campaign? The yes to fairer votes side, or the Britain stronger in Europe side? Or were they quite similar campaigns, really?
I would say they were similar in the sense that both of them were fairly big tent establishment campaigns. And often in a referendum campaign, if you're too big tent and too establishment and involving too many different stakeholders, it can become quite unwieldy. So, and you saw this, I think, particularly with the Strong Green campaign in the EU referendum, where, of course, you had everybody from all the leaderships of the political parties, except UKIP. But you also had the trade unions, you had the likes of the CBI. They tried to get different charities involved as well. When you start having a situation like that, yes, it's very impressive, but you're very unwieldy. And one of our strengths, I think, at both Vote Leave and No to AV was the fact that we were quite nimble. And particularly at Vote Leave, the fact that we could be reacting to the news in real time, I think gave us an advantage, particularly when it came to the short campaign. So, yes, too monolithic a campaign never works.
Just one last question on AV. Why did you prefer Vote Leave rather than No to EU, given the success of No to AV?
That's a good question. So, funnily enough, we waited for our naming until the referendum legislation went through. And if you recall, that was in approximately September 2015. And that's when the Electoral Commission decided the question would be Leave versus Remain. It could have been any number of things. It could have been yes or no. It could have been perhaps stay in, get out. Who knows? Very different permutations they tried. But they landed on Remain, Leave. And as soon as it was Leave, then we thought, right, that has to be part of the name. So it's very, very clear where people are putting their cross on the ballot paper. And then we went with Vote because it was an action. So very positive keyword, vote leave, the names on the tin. I've always liked campaigns going back to Taxpayers Alliance, or dare I say it, the Jobs for a Nation Now, where it's very, very clear what the campaign is all about. So vote leave was the name.
I want to turn to the lead up to the referendum taking place itself. And you suggested before, and in the book, in fact, you write, if David Cameron had actually delivered on the promises of the Bloomberg speech, I would have been queuing up to vote for the deal. I remember listening to the Bloomberg speech and some of the other things that David Cameron said around that time, and actually being quite surprised that he made some of the promises that he did. They seemed like such a hostage to fortune, because some of what he was promising seemed like it would violate some of the things on which the EU holds as being sacrosanct and will never compromise on. And I wonder, is it not the case, when thinking about how Cameron tried to handle this renegotiation and then the vote, I wonder whether there's actually any renegotiation that would have been possible, that would have been able to satisfy people on the more Eurosceptic side, or that dichotomy that you set out before, change or go. Could that only ever be answered with go?
Well, David Cameron set out his own parameters in the speech, and as you rightly point out, there were elements in there that it was unlikely the EU was ever going to go for. So I think one of them, for example, was restoring the supremacy of national parliaments. Now, to do that, it would, of course, have required treaty change. And as soon as that was ruled out in the July of 2015, that's where we went for leave. So, yes, it was a very ambitious settlement. And the other key thing to remember is that from the point of the Bloomberg speech onwards, he kept on repeating this phrase, Britain will be better off out an unreformed EU. And something I agreed with. Now, of course, that meant that when he came back with very little in February 2016, and you had everybody from the more Eurosceptic press right through to the BBC, Guardian, FT saying it was very little, then on his very own terms, he should have been for leave, or at least have sort of sat on the fence in the referendum. So I think that was a key moment where he actually started to lose a lot of credibility by going so firmly in for Remain and, the whole Project Fear and saying the sky would cave in. He started to look very inauthentic. To your question, though, is there anything that would have satisfied Eurosceptics more generally? There's a very interesting counterfactual about what David Cameron might have done differently. And I think there were two different things he could have done. One is perhaps doing more of the Harold Wilson approach, which both of you will know far better than I do. But that would have been to come back in February 2016 and to say, I've managed to get some concessions from the EU and some significant changes. There's a lot more I'd like to get. But on balance, I think we should stay in the EU and carry on fighting our corner. But it's now up to the country to decide. And then, just like Harold Wilson stepped back and allowed the country to decide and have two separate campaigns, had Cameron done that, I've got a feeling that he would have been in a stronger position come the 24th of June 2016 to stay on as Prime Minister and implement the will of the people. The second point is, though, that, and I've heard this argument run as well, should he have actually said to the EU, this isn't enough. In 2016, you could have said, you haven't made any serious concessions. This clearly isn't enough. Isn't anywhere close to what I was saying in the Bloomberg speech. We have to start again. And you'll remember that Cameron said the referendum would be before the halfway mark of the Parliament. So let's say roughly Christmas 2017. Had he gone back for more and basically showed the EU he was serious, I wonder if he would have got a few more concessions. You'll also recall that from the March, April, May 2015 time, the EU itself was starting to bring in restrictions to freedom of movement between the member states. So perhaps that could have been formalised in some way, and perhaps that would have been enough. I think probably certainly enough to flip at least 2% of the vote come the referendum. So, like I say, I think some form of delay might have worked in Cameron's favour.
Another intriguing counterfactual you raise in the book is during those coalition years, the positioning of the Labour Party with respect to a referendum. And you mention that Ed Balls, the Shadow Chancellor, was quite keen on Labour putting an in-out referendum on the EU in Labour's 2015 manifesto.
Yes.
Do you think that that could have helped Labour to win the 2015 general election? And if Labour had won that election and delivered on that manifesto promise of a referendum, how different would the dynamics of the referendum campaign have been for you in particular if it had been a Labour government that had legislated for a referendum than a Conservative government?
Oh, that's a fascinating one. It's worth noting a bit of the history of this. Of course, Nick Clegg was famously always in favour of an in-out referendum, and the Lib Dems constantly campaigned on this in the run-up to 2016. So this is one of their sort of key themes of the party. So on the left, they often did this sort of show they were in touch with the people, willing to give the people a say. So that would have changed things a lot. I guess it would have depended on at what point they came out in favour of this, whether or not it was before or after David Cameron's Bloomberg speech. How would it have been different had they been in office? It would have been intriguing to see if they'd tried to do any form of renegotiation ahead of time. That would have been an interesting part of the counterfactual. But I think the Conservative Party in opposition would have been much more Eurosceptic. We mentioned briefly the Change or Go publication that Business Britain did, which was a doorstopper of a publication, some 1,000 pages, outlining the different options for leaving the EU. That was actually really designed for partly for a Tory leadership election. My working assumption going into the 2015 general election was that the Conservatives would either carry on as a coalition with the Lib Dems or possibly lose to Ed Miliband, the situation you talk about. And I think had that happened and there'd been a Tory party leadership election, you would have seen a Tory leader emerge who was much more of a Brexiteer. So it would have been the Conservative Party much more firmly on the Brexit side of the camp come that referendum you talk about under a Labour government. So actually, I think things would have been easier from that front in many ways. But that's a very intriguing possibility.
I wanted to come on to the relationship between different parts of the Brexit movement, shall we say, and because this comes out a lot in, I think, all of the accounts of this. And clearly there's this challenge between the fact that Nigel Farage is a huge figure in the story of how Britain came to leave the European Union. But he's also quite a problematic figure in it as well. I mean, my own personal view of Farage is that he's a semi-serious politician in charge of a deeply unserious party, almost in every iteration that he ends up being in charge of. But you can see how serious he is about achieving his goals at times. And one of those moments, I wonder, is that you mentioned that he offered you a position within UKIP in 2014. I wonder whether you see that as being part of his attempt to recognise that in getting the Conservative commitment to an in-out referendum, UKIP had achieved something quite remarkable and profound, but that it couldn't be the people who were necessarily going to achieve what was necessary in that referendum should it come about.
I think that, like you, I see Farage as being somebody who is a hugely consequential figure. And I give him a lot of credit for all the campaigning he's done, going all the way back to the 1990s and the Maastricht Treaty and the point where Margaret Thatcher left office and the EU became a political project. And there was a whole sort of decade plus of him campaigning very much from the sidelines in these countless by-elections, and that took a lot of determination and perseverance. I give him a huge amount of credit for that as a politician to have gone through all of that. But at the same time, he's always realised as sort of leader of UKIP, Brexit Party, now Reform, that he can't be simply a one-man band, and he's managed to build out to a certain extent with Reform UK. But I think at the time as UKIP, he very much realised he needs to sort of grow the party, become more serious, pull in different people. I was never tempted by the offer to sort of go in and help with UKIP, but I saw it as a sign that he was serious about professionalising the party. That's a theme which I think continues this day with Reform UK.
And then we go from him making you that offer in 2014 to within a couple of years, there clearly being very bitter divides
Yeah.
between what would become the two wings of the Brexit movement, with Farage and Aaron Banks and others sitting very firmly outside of what would become the official and designated campaign.
Yeah.
I wonder how you look back on the ways in which that relationship was managed. And is it your view, as is sometimes suggested, that had Farage played a more prominent role, or had there been, as was apparently floated by him, he mentioned it in a TV show even just the other day, a merger between the two campaigns, that in fact Vote Leave would have been weaker and not stronger?
So I think there were two strategies, and that was the key divide between the two campaigns, in the sense that Nigel Farage, Aaron Banks, Leave.eu, their view after the 2015 general election was, we need to move quickly, we need to set up the campaign, we don't know what Cameron will get back from the deal, so we move quickly now, set it up, just assume he won't get, just assume the Tories won't be anywhere. And their idea was basically, let's concentrate on the core vote. Core vote, immigration, drive up the core vote numbers. Hopefully that will be enough to win a referendum. Our view at Vote Leave was different. This goes into the sort of political science around all of this with, Anthony Downs and his public choice theory and all that sort of stuff. Two candidates in a race, which is essentially what a referendum is. You need to be chasing that median vote, that swing voter in the centre. And the swing voter in this case was basically somebody who, which is roughly a third of voters, somebody who was inclined towards the Eurosceptic position, had doubts about the economics of Brexit, so needed reassurance on that point from the Leave campaign. But also, crucially, they didn't want to feel that they were voting for Nigel Farage and UKIP by voting Leave. So it's really important that they felt that the Leave campaign was bigger than simply Nigel Farage and UKIP and a few Eurosceptics from the Tory party and Labour on the sides. So that's why Vote Leave was set up very much to be a vehicle which the likes of Boris Johnson, Michael Gove, Gisela Stewart could jump on at the right point when the referendum was called. And what that meant was that we slightly pulled our punches in the early days. So, for example, we didn't really push things out in a big way until after the Tory party conference, because a lot of the Tory MPs, Steve Baker and others in Conservative Britain, wanted to be able to play a full and active role in Tory party conference as Conservative Britain. So we sort of were holding back from the perspective of Farage. And we had our eye on the prize for what happens after the renegotiation. So there's a lot of frustration there, but it boils down to two different types of strategy. But as we're now seeing with, I guess in some ways with Restore UK and the rise of Restore UK and Rupert Lowe, the Eurosceptic side of politics or the right side of politics has always been quite combustible, and there have been lots of egos to manage, and that was one of my key challenges running the Vote Leave campaign. But yes, it was quite unusual having a campaign where you're basically going through this situation a bit like a sort of US presidential election, where you have this primary part of the campaign where both sides are going hammer at tongs. Then you have the general election part of the campaign where people try and unite together.
Another part of the Eurosceptic movement is the Eurosceptic left, the Labour leavers, a tradition I put myself in. And you write in the book, you describe yourself as a small state conservative who believes in free trade and low taxes, but you say that message, quote, will not win you 50% of the vote. And you go on to write, our message was in some ways closer to Corbyn than to Cameron, only without the metropolitan bias. So how important was it for you to bring Labour people into the campaign? And which Labour figure would you have liked to have brought on side, but you were not able to do so?
Well, that's a great question. So first of all, the importance of having Labour support. Obviously, like with the No to AV campaign, we wanted to show that we were a broad coalition. we knew we'd get a very good chunk of Conservatives signed up. It was never clear how many, but we knew we'd get a good chunk. And of course, UKIP would definitely be part of the overall mix. So actually stretching out and having Labour people involved, people from the Green Party involved, Jenny Jones, some people from the Lib Dems as well, Liberal Leave, was really important to show we had that breadth, both to get the designation, but also to always give voters within those parties permission, if you like, to vote for their candidate, to vote Leave rather. So getting Labour people was really important. Now, there were some really traditional Labour Eurosceptics, and we started off with the brilliant Kate Hoey and Graham Stringer, and they were very involved from the outset. John Mills, of course, had been co-chairman of Business of Britain, who's a significant figure within the Labour Party from a business point of view and a donor point of view, and Ed Miliband, so he was a real catch for BFB. So having their involvement was really important. And then really once David Cameron came back with his so-called deal and people started deciding which side they'd be on, attracting Gisela Stuart was really important. She was part of a long-standing, should we say, more moderate Eurosceptic position within the Labour movement, involving herself, the likes of Derek Scott, of course, her late husband, who wasn't around at the time, but also people like sort of David Owen, if you talk about the wider left movement. And David came on board as well, which was fantastic. So that was all great. Who would I have liked to have got? That's a great question.
Jeremy Corbyn, you credit him with part of the victory. If Corbyn had come out for Leave, would you have wanted him in Vote Leave, or would you have sent him to join his friend George Galloway in Grassroots Out?
So actually, having Jeremy Corbyn out there, I think would have been a good thing at the time, where politics was at the time. So I wouldn't have any problem with that. But the fact that the Labour Party under Corbyn did so little during the campaign was, I think, crucial. So you'll know the history of this far better than I do, but had there been a different Labour leader after Ed Miliband, one who had put his or her heart and soul into campaigning for Remain, that would have been a game changer, I think, and probably worth more than the 2% margin which we won by. So Corbyn's victory as leader, and then basically staying out of the referendum and allowing Labour voters to sort of see the Labour Party as a whole as being split sort of 50-50, Leave Remain, was a crucial part of the victory.
I've often thought if Tony Benn, who died in 2014, had lived a couple more years and come out for Leave, that Corbyn, who was very much a disciple of Benn, would have been quite tempted to do the same. And I often also think if Bob Crow, the RMT leader, hadn't died so young in 2014, that would have also been quite influential for Corbyn. Another person who died just a few months before the referendum was Dennis Healey, who died in October of 2015. And my understanding is that by the time, by that time, Healey had basically become a Brexiteer. Right. So that would have been very interesting if he and Lawson had teamed up together or something like that.
Yes.
Did you make? I mean, did you make any overtures to the Labour leadership? I mean, John McDonnell, for example, had put leaving the EU in his leadership manifesto when he stood in 2007. Or did you feel that actually the best thing they could do was just to sort of take this ambivalent position?
So we didn't personally, and I can't speak for what Labour Leave did. As you know, as a result of the whole sort of designation process and the arguments between Vote Leave and Leave.eu and others, you ended up with a situation where there was a Labour Leave campaign headed up by John Mills and Brendan Chilton running it. And they basically stayed agnostic in the designation process and said, we'll work with whoever is the official campaign. So it was really more up to them to deal with the Labour leadership.
You've spoken about how a big part of what Vote Leave was trying to achieve is appealing to that median voter who, in a binary question like this, was as you say, quite obviously going to be the people who solve the question, who provide the answer. And I think when you look at the book, and when listeners look at the book, and when they think back to the Vote Leave campaign, they can see a big sense of the ways in which you're trying to do that, particularly with some reassurance around the economy as quite an early sort of feature of the campaign. But as we then think about how the campaign progressed, and in the fortnight leading up to the referendum in particular, we should confront the fact that some of the stuff coming out of the Vote Leave campaign was itself quite fruity. The stuff about Turkey joining, etc., and seemingly Boris Johnson being very annoyed about that, and a bit of more of a focus on immigration. So clearly this divide between Farage can handle the fixated Eurosceptics and we're after the median was clearly quite a blurred line as well. So how did you try and manage the way in which there were different groups of voters that you were talking to without alienating certain blocks as you went along?
I think there's a question of timing with these things. So, as you quite rightly point out, we spent a lot of time thinking about the economic side of the campaign, with swing voters being so important. So, the whole creation of Business of Britain, to be able to show that business was divided and have business leaders out there who were willing to speak up for Brexit, was really crucial to all of that. And a very sort of, I would say, quite positive, more economic-based message between, money-based message from our launch up until, like you were saying, more or less April-May time of the campaign. And then, of course, we did do more on migration as a question. I would put that more in terms of it's a phasing of the campaign. And if you think back to something like the Labour Party general election of 1997, Tony Blair's huge victory. What did they do? Theirs was basically a reassurance campaign in the years running up. And it was basically trying to reassure people that the Labour Party will be able to be good stewards of the economy and, matching, Ken Clarke's spending plans and all these different pledges they made to sort of show how they would be good stewards with the economy. That was an economic message, essentially. But then towards the end of that campaign, they went in hard in terms of, 2 weeks to save the NHS or whatever the point was. Had they gone with their NHS message first of all, things might have been different. So you often go with a broader message to start off with, one which really attracts the swing voters you're trying to attract. But then towards the end, you go with more of a core vote message to drive up turnout amongst the people you need. So there was a deliberate phasing to all of that.
And just on the immigration point, you mentioned in the book that there was a moment where Dominic Cummings tweeted out something about the sex attacks in Cologne and how Brexit was a way of making Britain safer from these kinds of attacks, and that this was perceived as a gaffe, a mistake, to put that out. But you write rather interestingly. You say, 10 years on, such a tweet might seem passé, but public opinion and political opinion was in a very different place in 2016. And I thought about that when I saw the recent BBC documentary about Brexit, where Nigel Farage reflects on his Breaking Point poster. And in that, he says something quite similar, where he says, I don't think that poster would cause such a fuss today. So how was the political conversation about immigration different in 2016 compared to 2026? And why do you think that there is a difference?
So I think in the 10 years since that point, people are now a lot more concerned about migration than they were perhaps at the time. Just last year, of course, Keir Starmer delivered his speech. I know there's controversy about whether he meant it or not, but talking about Britain being an island of strangers. And to use that very emotive language was quite telling for a sort of a Labour Party leader who's a human rights lawyer and from Islington and that sort of thing. And people were quite taken aback. Had Nigel Farage said something similar during the campaign, it would have been massively explosive and possibly have pulled the campaign into the water. So why have things changed? I think it's public opinion has changed in a big way. And and you've got to reflect where you are at a time. And when, just going back to Dominic's tweet, that was in something like January 2016, when we were in the middle of the whole explosions and in that sort of pre-designation period, when it was before, in fact, we got the cabinet ministers on board. So I felt at the time it was really important that we kept a more sort of sure and steady approach, showing that we were the competent campaign and not going off message, rather than just doing random tweets that would, yes, get some headlines, but would almost suggest we were very similar to the Leave.eu campaign.
The party management side of the Brexit campaign I always find fascinating, particularly as it concerns David Cameron's role, because, among other things, to give a bit of context, it's worth telling listeners that you are yourself a Conservative peer.
Yes.
And of course, many of the most prominent figures in the Leave campaign were people who just a year earlier had campaigned passionately and keenly for David Cameron to be re-elected, and in some cases, of course, were very long-standing and very close friends of his, as well as political partners of his. And of course, what makes it so fascinating is, on the one hand, they're campaigning for a project which they must know, if they win, will end his political career. I wonder to what extent you would say that they did fully appreciate that if Vote Leave was successful, then that was David Cameron's career finished.
It's a very interesting question, that. I think a lot of us suspected that would happen, but we were keen not to make that the focus of the referendum. And certainly towards the end of the campaign, there were lots of efforts on both the Conservative Leave and Remain sides to think about how they could shore up David Cameron after the vote. So, for example, the week building up to the referendum day itself, I remember lots of discussions that Boris Johnson and Michael Gove were having with other senior figures on the Tory Remain side about joint letters that could be written and joint press releases that could be put out after the result to shore up David Cameron's position. What was interesting was, though, that they were all working under the assumption that essentially Remain was going to win. Right up until referendum day, Michael and Boris were basically of the view that Remain was going to win the referendum. So really they were thinking along the sort of David Cameron lines of how do you deal with the party management and pulling people back together, and not thinking we were going to win. So, of course, once we left, could David Cameron have stayed on? I think had he gone for more of the Harold Wilson approach to the referendum, he probably could have. But because he committed himself so decisively to Remain, and some of the things he said about Project Fear and the economy collapsing and World War III taking place, it was very difficult to walk back from that.
Do you think, in a sense, he was too soft as a party leader? Because, of course, he does abandon collective responsibility within the cabinet. Those famous images of people like Michael Gove and Priti Patel, Chris Grayling, all walking into the Vote Leave headquarters and signing the poster. They've left a cabinet meeting, to do that. And of course, he also makes the Conservative Party neutral on the question and doesn't sort of allow the Conservative Party to take a particular view in the campaign or use its resources one way or another. Do you think that was just a reflection of what he had to do to try and keep the party as together as he could? Or do you think he could have been a bit tougher with the leavers or the potential leavers within his own party?
I'm sure that looking back, he would probably reflect that he should have been tougher, both in terms of party management, but also in terms of how the Remain campaign dealt with Michael and Boris. There's talk of all sorts of posters and images they dreamt up of basically saying that Michael and Boris and Farage were part of the same camp as Nick Griffin and the BNP, and all sorts of posters to do with that, which they didn't decide to use because they wanted to keep Michael and Boris within the Conservative family and to be able to sort of reassemble the Conservatives after the election. So I'm sure looking back, he thinks he should have been tougher. I guess there's a great counterfactual about what he should have done with the cabinet ministers. Should he have basically said to them, look, you're very welcome to campaign for leave, but you've got to resign from your positions in government to do so. That would have upped the pressure a bit. I don't think he would be able to go so far as to say that the Conservative Party as an entity should have campaigned for Remain. I think the party was too split on the issue for that to happen, so that would have been probably too far. But could he have done other things, like, for example, on the date of the referendum? I devote part of the book to looking into the referendum legislation that went through in the September of 2015 and looking at the different permutations when it came to things like the type of question being asked, but also the date. And there is something to say that he should perhaps have gone for a date which coincided with the local elections, for example, arguably. But then again, turnout was so high in the EU referendum, far higher than it would have been in a local election. I'm not sure it would have made much difference.
In the final days of the campaign, of course, there's the tragic murder of Joe Cox, the Labour MP. And in the immediate aftermath of that killing, the campaigns suspend activity for a period of time to be able to show respect to her. And then the campaigns restart. But there does seem to be a decision made on the other side not to bring out some of the bigger hitting set pieces that they were planning to do, like the governor of the Bank of England coming out for Remain. And I think a lot of people, including myself, when Joe Cox was tragically killed, who were Leavers, felt that was the end of the Leave campaign, in the sense that we felt that, I remember saying at the time, I felt that Leave could not win under these circumstances. Do you think in a sort of way that tragic event caused the Remain campaign to take their foot off the pedal a bit, and that I'm not to say that they were complacent, but perhaps they were a bit complacent about their chances of victory going into the final days?
I think they certainly made a miscalculation, because they did change their messaging from that weekend onwards to being one more about country coming together. It was almost sort of vote Remain for Joe. It was off message compared to what their message had been up until that point. And I think had they stuck to their message of, to use shorthand, Project Fair, wheeling out Mark Carney and others, and talk about what would have to happen in terms of the economy, were Britain to vote for Leave, that would have kept them more focused in those final days. And of course, what all campaigns need to think of, both in a referendum and a general election, a lot of people only really tune in on those final days of the campaign, certainly the final week of the campaign. So if you start going off message and start being all over the place, a lot of people who are just tuning in for the first time and hearing the message for the first time, if they're not hearing the message that actually resonates and makes a difference, then they're not hearing the right message from your point of view. So, yes, I think there's a very strong case to be made that they, either through miscalculation or complacency, went off piece at that point. Of course, they were also probably hoping that there was that natural sort of swing back towards the status quo that you often get in referendum campaigns. And perhaps they were hoping that would really kick in a big way in this final few days.
And in the book, you make a lot of the predictions that Remain's going to win. You share a lot of the expert surveys, which were very confident that Remain would win. You demonstrate that Boris Johnson and Michael Gove seemed pretty convinced that Remain was going to win, and you share some of their speeches they were planning to give if Remain had won. And yet you suggest that you were always thinking it was more likely than not that Leave would win. At least that's my read in the book. Why did you have that confidence, and did you ever waver?
So my confidence was based on a few points. I felt pretty confident that if we were able to get a situation where David Cameron didn't come back with very much, and then from that point, we were able to get a good chunk of senior figures who would appeal to mainstream voters on board, as we did, Boris, Michael, Giesler, etc. And then have the designation go our way, so with the official campaign. With those sort of three things in place, I felt we were in a very good chance to win because I could see the polling. That's what the polling suggested. If we had those three things in place, we'd win. And from the point that we got the designation, we were running a really super efficient and flexible and impactful campaign. There were ups and downs like there were with all campaigns, and at different times there were sort of muddy issues, as you get with all campaigns towards the end. There were different disagreements, but fundamentally we'd worked out the message that would appeal to those swing voters. We had the right messengers delivering that message. We were making full use of all the leaflets you get, the TV debates, which went our way. We had a very big push on social media towards the end. So we were doing all the fundamentals right when it came to the campaign. So based on all of that, I was highly confident of victory, let's say 10 days out. Like yourself, when it came to that week out, breaking point poster, Joe Cox's murder, then I started to think, how will this affect things? But actually from the weekend, when we started on the Saturday to do more focus groups, polling, to work out how the country reacted to that and to work out our final messaging, the final push, it became very clear that the country, the voters at large, were able to differentiate between the awful murder of Joe Cox and the vote in the referendum. They were seen as two separate things.
At times throughout our discussion, you've mentioned things that you think may or may not have been worth the 2% swing.
Yes.
That would have determined the final result. I mean, how many of those do you think there are, really? I mean, how many different contingencies are there in the lead up to this where you think this could have gone another way?
Well, let's do the list. So we've talked about Labour, and had Labour gone for a Remain leader, that certainly would have been worth 2%. Should we say Leave.eu got the designation rather than Vote Leave, that definitely would have been worth more than 2%. Had Boris not come out for Leave, again, that would have been worth more than 2%. Had Vote Leave not existed, so basically had Business of Britain not been set up, which gave the foundations to Vote Leave, again, that would have been worth more than 2%. I could probably think of another half dozen if it came to it, but certainly the fundamentals were there for a Leave victory. I think that writers like Dennis McShane, the former Labour MP, he wrote a book actually ahead of Leave's victory, saying why Leave was going to win. And having read the book, I agree with a lot of the fundamentals that he makes. But I don't think it was inevitable. We had to have certain things go in our favour in the year running up to it, and we needed to run a competent campaign to win. But it was certainly sort of, I certainly felt 10 days out, all the right things were in place to win. I certainly felt on the day that we were in a good position to win, and we shouldn't be thinking we were going to lose.
It's one of the fascinating things, I think, about this referendum, that on one level, the fundamentals really do suggest that a Leave is not just plausible, but perhaps in some ways the inevitable position for Britain to leave. But at the same time, the actual outcome on the 23rd of June 2016 also feels highly contingent. But the final question I wanted to ask from me, but it's really about the constitutional nature of referendums and campaigns as they relate to outcomes and then delivering them. Because if we're to be generous to Vote Leave as a campaign, well, it's not really for the campaign to do much more than win and to make the arguments required to win. It's not necessarily for you to think about, well, what are the complications in Northern Ireland and how will they be managed subsequently? But nevertheless, they are problems, even if they're not the campaign's problems. And of course, this speaks in part to the fact that we have these designated campaigns, but they're not parties themselves. They don't continue to exist necessarily afterwards. They don't put together
Exactly.
manifestos and take over government. And in this case, even the Prime Minister to replace Cameron wasn't even a leaver, let alone a vote leaver.
Yes.
Do you think it's dangerous, the way in which Britain frames referendums in this way? Not just to have the referendum in and of itself, but to separate out the campaigns from perhaps the politicians or the parties or the actual institutions that are going to end up delivering the outcome?
I mean, how else could it have been done? I guess you could have a situation whereby David Cameron, having not really managed to get anything from a renegotiation, he could have then said to the EU, well, ahead of me holding this referendum, will you also agree to the terms on which we'll leave? So I can put both sides to the country. So obviously, as Prime Minister, he had the mandate to be able to negotiate with the EU. Perhaps he could have done that. I certainly think that as a campaign, both when it came to all the work that Business Britain had done on things like Change or Go, or indeed other publications done by other think tanks in terms of what Leave might look like, and indeed during the campaign itself, Michael Gove made a very compelling case about how Leave could look. I think it was dubbed the Albanian model at the time, but basically it was sort of roughly speaking where things actually landed up towards the end. But it wasn't up to us as a campaign to say this is definitely what will happen in terms of our relationship with the EU. We had no mandate to do that as a campaign. I do think you touched on Theresa May and being a Remainer. That, of course, is what a great regret that it didn't go straight from the referendum to, for example, Boris being PM. I think it was always going to be the case that Brexit was more easily implemented by a Brexiteer rather than a Remainer. It's very clear that she didn't understand what Brexit was all about. She thought it was all about migration, basically. That's why it was a big migration focus. And she thought that the voters would be happy being rule takers rather than rule makers, and therefore checkers were being fine. So that led to 3 years of sort of dither and delay, which was hugely problematic and a great pity.
Final question.
Sure.
One of the fun things about this book is that you talk about all the different places that you were plotting.
Oh, yes.
The Tate Britain, the Moon Under the Water, Wetherspoons and Balham, the
Yes.
balcony of the Reform Club, Grumble's Restaurant, Pimlico. So where is your favourite place to plot and why?
That's a great question. Tate Britain was always a favourite of Dan Hannon's, and he's talked a lot about this, how it was close enough to Westminster for people to sneak away, but because, in his words, MPs are so uncivilised, they would never go to Tate Britain to actually look at the pictures. So you could always be safe and have safe meetings and secret meetings there. I've always liked my more food-based locations, and obviously there are some very sort of prominent places in Westminster where you can eat. And at the time in Osteria dell'Angelo, the Italian restaurant I used to go to a lot, that's more prominent. You went there to be seen, really, rather than to purely to eat. I've always liked breakfast. I've always liked my greasy spoons. And there's several very good greasy spoons in London, which people like to go to in the mornings, which I often frequent. So, yes, I'm more of a food-based person when it comes to socialising.
Well, Lord Elliott, thank you so much for joining us. As a reminder for our listeners, your new book is 10 Years On, The Untold Story of Brexit, marking, of course, the anniversary of the referendum campaign that you played such a key role in winning. We'll have a link for the book in our show notes, and we strongly commend it to the listeners. As Richard said at the outset, really a treasure trove of insights into the way in which the campaign was won.
Thanks very much.
Thank you so much.